You know, it's amazing how far you can get with 3 chords and an attitude. And your starting point doesn't matter, has no bearing on this. I mean, look at Nirvana. They're from Aberdeen, Washington. This little bitty band from a rundown logging town at the end of a dead-end 2-lane highway to nowhere. Then look at Three Doors Down. They've sold millions of records. And where are they from? Escatawpa, Mississippi, a place that barely rates a truck stop on Interstate 10 on your way out of Louisiana and into Alabama. And then there's Nickelback. They're from Hanna, Alberta. Where's Hanna, Alberta? Exactly. That's what I mean. Nickelback has gone from playing covers at the National Bar and Grill on Main Street in Hanna to selling millions of records and their own record label and Grammy nominations and Juno nominations. How the hell did this happen? 3 chords and an attitude, baby. 3 chords and an attitude.
Now, the ongoing history of new music.
Just a child with a temper. Haven't you heard, don't hit a lady? Kicking your ass would be a pleasure. Oh! Oh! He's drunk again. It's time to fight. Same old just on a different night. She grabs the gun. She's had enough. Tonight she'll find out. What tough is this man?
Nickelback with one of the many big songs from their 2001 album Silver Side Up. It's real easy to remember the release date of that record. It hit the stores in the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. Hi there, I'm Alan Cross, and although the focus of this show is Nickelback, it's really about every guy and girl who dreams of breaking out of the basement and onto the world stage. Great rock, and the next great rock band, can come from anywhere. Not just the big cities and major centers. If the heart is there and the songs are right, geography doesn't mean a thing. Whatever you think of Nickelback, be you a fan or part of the backlash, you got to admire what they've done. I mean, Hannah, Alberta. This is 3,000 people 2.5 hours east of Calgary on Highway 9 on your way to Kindersley. That's in Saskatchewan, by the way. Officially, it's the home of the Canada Grey Goose. It's a big bird in the town's logo, and there's a restaurant called the Canada Grey on 2nd Avenue in town. The town maintains a website, and it features things like announcements for babysitting courses. The local papers carry headlines like, "Cold weather hard on newborn calves." The pace is slower, the people are more friendly, and everyone is genuinely proud of their little slice of the world. And like a lot of these places, Hannah has produced some NHLers. This is Lanny McDonald's hometown. In other words, Hannah is just like thousands of similar-sized towns scattered across the Canadian prairies. This particular town just happens to be the birthplace of one of the biggest-selling Canadian rock bands of the last 10 years. 15 years ago, the prospect of this happening seemed as dim as grabbing one of those gray geese and flying it to the moon. I mean, Chad Kroeger was a bad kid, and I mean really, really bad. By the time he was 14, Chang, which is the nickname that he liked, Chad had been charged with breaking into her almost a dozen times, and for his trouble he was sent to a correctional facility for young offenders where he met up with a bunch of 17-year-olds who were bigger and meaner and more violent than he was. Now, it sounds harsh, but it was a good experience because it scared him straight. Had he not been sent to jail, Chad figures that he would have never got into music, and he would have been robbing convenience stores or dealing drugs across central and eastern Alberta. Chad actually admits that he probably would have made a pretty good drug dealer. He had the aptitude for it back then. Nickelback came together in 1995 when Chad was about 19. The group featured him, his younger brother Mike on bass, and another brother named Brandon on drums. The only non-family member of the original Nickelback was guitarist Ryan Peake. They all got together to jam at the Kruger House on 4th Avenue. And to keep the neighbors from complaining about the noise, they lined the walls of the rehearsal room with old mattresses. The Krugers were actually a pretty musical family. My grandfather was a provincial politician who had a band on the side called the Tory Blue Notes that featured his wife on drums. And Chad and Mike and Brandon's mom was a pretty fair amateur piano player. She was the one who encouraged her boys to get into music. When the boys started the band, they weren't known as Nickelback. They were called the Village Idiots. They got gigs at the National Restaurant and Bar on Main Street, sharing the stage with the weekly Stripper on Saturday nights. The following year, Chad and his brothers borrowed $4,000 from their stepfather and relocated to Vancouver. And to support himself, Mike Kruger got a job as a barista at the Starbucks store at 3451 the Kingsway in the east end of the city, where it butts up against Burnaby. This is where the band got its new name. When Mike was making change for lattes, he repeatedly gave customers their Nickelback. The gig at Starbucks helped finance the first Nickelback EP. It was called Hesher, apparently because they had a buddy who had a habit of saying, "Hey, sure," to everything. And it featured a bunch of songs Chad had written through 1993 and 1994. Now here's a sample of that EP, which saw the light of day in late March of 1996. This is called Fly.
Father, tell me something. Where the bandmen go when they die? Mother says you'll go there, but wings for her and I don't mind, 'cause I have always wanted to learn to fly, learn to fly, learn to fly. Brother, tell me something. If I take this, am I going to die? And he says no. So then I figure, what the hell, I'll try. 'Cause it's my life, so light the match and you and I will fly. Learn to fly. Learn to fly. Learn to fly.
Nickelback and Fly, their first ever single from their debut EP, Hesher. By the way, that EP has effectively disappeared. Those willing to part with their copies now find them worth big dollars on eBay. After Hesher came Curb, another indie record that sold surprisingly well. In its original incarnation, Nickelback moved about 10,000 copies. Not bad for something that was recorded in a friend's basement. Let's talk about the title track of that record. Like Hesher, it was inspired by a friend, this time a guy named Kirby. And this is a really sad story. Back in Hannah, 17-year-old Kirby was going out with a 16-year-old girl who lived out in the country. And one night, he snuck out to see her and was bombing over a hill on a gravel road when he got into a head-on collision with another car. Kirby stumbled out of the car only to realize that the driver of the other car was his girlfriend. She had snuck out to see him at exactly the same time. And she died.
Go.
Curb was a pretty solid album, featured all of Nickelback's best stuff, including a couple of songs that had appeared on the Hesher EP. They made a video for Fly, and it got some airplay on Much Music and some local radio exposure. Here's another sample from Curb. This is called Little Friend. Nickelback from their 1996 indie album called Curb. There were a couple of lineup changes after Curb came out. Brother Brandon Kruger gave up the drum gig for a real job and was temporarily replaced by a guy named Rich Guindon. His spot was soon taken by Ryan Vicadel. He's the dude that's keeping time today. It was also around this time that Nickelback made the decision to manage themselves. You see, when Mike Kruger was working at Starbucks, Chad Kruger was selling ad space in a soccer magazine. This experience gave him some basic marketing knowledge, and he thought that he could put what he had learned into effect for the band. So he convinced the rest of Nickelback that this was the way to go. They would do everything on their own. So over the next few years, the band did all the legwork themselves. Chad was the guy who handled radio promotion. Mike was in charge of dealing with the manufacture and distribution of the CDs. Ryan booked the gigs, and everybody watched the money situation very, very closely. All of this hard work paid off. Plus, they got a little bit of unexpected help from the Canadian government. That part of the story is next.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
I'm sure you've heard about something called Canadian content regulations. These are rules that say that Canadian radio stations have to devote a minimum of 35% of their playlists to Canadian artists. We can debate if that's a good or bad thing another time, but you won't find Nickelback on the negative side of that debate, and here's why. That quota used to be 33%, but in the late 90s, the regs took things to 35%. And at first glance, a 2% increase doesn't really sound like much, but it did send Canadian radio programmers scrambling to find new music to fill this gap. And that's when Nickelback showed up with The State. This second album was recorded for $30,000 and was released in January of 2000. The same month, the regulations were changed. And because of that little break, a song called Leader of Men started being heard. It was the beginning of Nickelback's fast ride to the top.
Tell your friends not to think out loud until they swallow. Whisper things into my brain. Your voice sounds so hollow. I am not a leader of men, since I prefer to follow. Do you think I could have a drink, since it's so hard to swallow? Yeah, so hard to swallow. Turn your television off, and I will sing a song. And if you suddenly have the urge, you can say hello. I touch your hand, touch your face. I think the fruit is rotten. Give me lessons on how to breathe, 'cause I think I've forgotten. Yeah, think I've forgotten. One day out to a cliff that overlooks the water. I looked in to see a girl. It was somebody's daughter. Now the ring is on my hand was given to me by her. And to this day we all sit around and dream of ways to get higher. Yeah, get much higher. Tell your friends not to think out loud until they swallow. Whisper things into my brain. Your voice sounds so hollow. Yeah, I am not a leader of men, since I prefer to follow. Do you think I could have a drink, since it's so hard to swallow? Yeah, so hard to swallow.
Nickelback toured like crazy behind the state. They played more than 200 shows in 2000 alone, and the more they played, the more people paid attention. And the singles just kept on coming.
Come around about 10 o'clock. You can hear 'em, you can tell by the way they knock. Somebody said the other one had a badge and told you anything anymore. On the telephone or on the bell, somebody said revenge serves the code. I told ya, they're growing dope everywhere around the block. You can smell it, you can tell by the way they talk. Somebody stole 5 for gasoline. I told ya, I thought if I stayed on you, run away. Well, come on back and try again some day. Well, somebody's gonna do it again, gonna make me turn against all of my friends. So you better have something to say. I'll never do it again. No, I won't. Less and less. We don't. I find my life 'cause I'm spending it since you got just what you wanted. I'll never do it again. No, I won't. Try not to, no, I don't. I find my life 'cause I'm spending it since you got just what you wanted. What you wanted. What you wanted. What you wanted.
Worthy to say, one of 4 singles from the States. It did so well in Canada, thanks in part to those new radio regs I was talking about, that they were snapped up by a record label. Now, a lot of record labels were interested, but in the end, Nickelback decided to go with Roadrunner Records. Okay, you're probably saying, what? Who? Roadrunner. Nickelback knew that if they were going to take their career to the next level, they had to break into the American market. And in order to do that, they needed an American base of operations. And in a very shrewd move, they chose to go with a small, nimble label with a reputation of being able to react quickly to market conditions, and more importantly, having the time and resources to pay very close attention to all the bands on their roster. With only a few bands to worry about, Roadrunner is able to plug records very effectively through a well-defined and well-developed series of contacts and alliances. Roadrunner had done very well with groups like Fear Factory and Slipknot and Typo Negative and Sepultura and even death metal groups like Deicide. In other words, they specialize in heavy music and they understand heavy music. They know the audience, they know the culture. Here's a tip. If you have a record company that's willing to work your record hard, you have a better chance of succeeding in the shark pool that is the music industry. In a very short time, Nickelback went from playing bars and clubs to touring with Creed and Three Doors Down and Fuel. The State picked up steam, eventually going gold in the U.S. And that means 500,000 copies of an indie record that was made for a grand total of 30,000 Canadian dollars. Talk about a return on your investment.
To the other, we do it all again. same. Equal treatment never ever comes in. Here they go again. All I ever really wanted was to be like you. So perfect, so worthless. If I could take it all back, think again, I would. And I found it, found I know it. I didn't want this. Somebody help me see it now. Feel it, feel that I've been there. I didn't need this. Somebody help me stand. And I know them. I didn't want this. I didn't need this. Somebody help me breathe. Somebody help me breathe. Somebody help me.
So here's Nickelback at the end of the ride that saw the state go gold in the U.S. Pretty good for some boys from nowhere, Alberta, but things were about to get even bigger. A whole lot bigger. Hang on.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
Once Nickelback proved themselves as a viable concern, more money and more resources were made available to record their next album. This meant a bigger studio and some outside production help. They brought in a guy named Rick Parashar, a guy renowned for his work with Alice in Chains and Blind Melon and Pearl Jam. He's the guy who helped give Pearl Jam their sound for the 10 album, and we all know how well that record did. Nickelback went into the studio with some ideas. Some were good, some were bad, some were difficult. For example, towards the very end of the sessions, they were working on this one song fragment that just didn't want to come together. Chad had this last-minute idea for a song, but it just wasn't working. They had 5 or 6 different phrases, all pretty good, but how could you stitch them all together coherently? And it was Ryan, the drummer, who figured things out. He says, let's play this one part and then come to a full stop. Then let's play the next little bit and come to another stop. And then let's insert the title in a really plaintive voice. And that's when a roadie chimed in. He says, okay, that's good, but you need a big full stop at the end of the last chorus. So they did it, and it was like, yeah, that's it, we got it. So 10 minutes later, literally 10 minutes later, the song was done. And, well, you know the rest.
Never made it as a wise man. I couldn't cut it as a poor man stealing. Tired of living like a blind man. I'm sick aside without a sense of feeling. And this is how you remind me. This is how you remind me of what I really am. This is how you remind me of what I really am. It's not like you to say sorry. I was waiting on a different story. This time I'm mistaken for handing you a heart worth breaking. And I've been wrong, I've been down, been to the bottom of every Never made it as a wise man. I couldn't cut it as a poor man stealing. And this is how you remind me. This is how you remind me. This is how you remind me of what I really am. This is how you remind me of what I really am. It's not like you to say sorry. I was waiting on a different story. This time I'm mistaken. Beforehand I knew a heart worth breaking. And I've been wrong, I've been down, been to the bottom of every bottle. These 5 words in my head scream out, we haven't fun yet. Yeah, yeah. Oh, we haven't fun yet. Yeah, yeah. Oh, we haven't fun yet. Yeah, yeah. Oh, we haven't fun yet.
Nickelback, with the song that established them as major league players in the universe of rock in 2001 and 2002. And here's a little-known fact about that track. It was mixed by a guy named Randy Staub, a dude who has worked with bands like Metallica and P.O.D. He modeled the sound and sheen of the final mix on the Lifehouse song, Hangin' by a Moment. It's actually kind of hard to grasp how big How You Remind Me was. Let me try and put this all into perspective. First of all, there's a matter of timing. It was a growly, non-wimpy, power-type ballad that came out just when the aggressive sound of bands like Limp Bizkit was starting to lose its appeal. It was the right song at the right time, and people were ready for a song with melody. Secondly, the song had major female appeal. It had to be the fact that it focused on relationships. How You Remind Me was, in fact, inspired by Chad's ex-girlfriend, Jody. It became a huge #1 hit in countries around the world. In fact, it was a #1 single in Canada and the United States at the same time. And the last time a Canadian band managed that feat, it was the Guess Who with American Woman back in 1970. The single also hit #1 on the very fickle UK charts. But let's just go back to America for a second. We have the technology to actually count the number of times a song is played on the radio. It's complicated, but trust me when I tell you that it works. It is an undisputed scientific and statistical fact that How You Remind Me was played on American radio more than any other song in 2002. It was played exactly 421,770 times over the course of 365 days. At one point in its existence, How You Remind Me was heard on the radio by more people in a single week than any other rock song ever. Again, the industry has the technology to track this information. In that 1 week in 2000 alone, it is known that 131 million Americans were exposed to How You Remind Me. Now, if you do the math, that meant that somewhere in the U.S., a radio station sparked up How You Remind Me every 3.3 minutes. But hang on, the song is just over 3.6 minutes long. So the truth is, for that 1 week, How You Remind Me essentially played continuously on American radio for 7 days. And there's more. Radio stations pay a fee for the privilege of playing songs as part of their business. A song like How You Remind Me might earn a couple of cents per play, but if you're talking 421,770 spins, those pennies add up. It's also estimated that for every week a song spends at #1, it generates royalties of $500,000 US. And that's before you add in album sales, before you add in concert ticket revenue, before you add in side deals with TV shows and movie soundtracks and the sales of T-shirts. So, no wonder the guys in Nickelback can't stop smiling. By the way, the roadie that made the crucial final suggestion for How You Remind Me was given a $5,000 bonus. Here's another track from Silver Side Up. Woke Up This Morning is another one of those emotional songs. Chad wrote it days after his grandmother passed away, and he was really angry at the way the funeral was conducted. And that explains all the references to church. And then there's the matter of Jody, the ex-girlfriend. She figured into the making of this song, too. Nickelback from their super breakthrough album, Silver Side Up. Counting the number of albums sold is a tricky thing, but it's safe to say that it hit the 9 or 10 million mark. 5 million guaranteed in the United States by the end of March 2003. Not bad for a bunch of kids from a small town in the Canadian prairies, right? And there's more. Chad is one smart dude. He and his lawyer buddy have set up their own record label, 604 Records, named after the area code of Vancouver. They scored big with Theory of a Dead Man, their first signing. And then there's the matter of Default. Chad Kruger played a big part in getting them started, and they've sold 1 million records. Plus, Chad's got this reputation as a songwriter. Carlos Santana asked him to write a song for his Shaman album, and Faith Hill, the country star, wants to work with him. And hey, who could forget Hero, the big hit from the Spider-Man soundtrack? And to think it all started with a kid who specialized in breaking into pickup trucks. 3 chords and an attitude. It can change everything. Back in a moment with one final and very, very weird piece of Nickelback information. You gotta hear this.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
Whenever a band breaks it huge for an extended period of time, there's the inevitable backlash, and Nickelback is not immune to this kind of thing. Let me just share one thing with you. In June of 2002, Kerrang! Magazine, a pretty intense British metal mag, conducted an online poll, and the question was, who is the ugliest man in rock? The final list featured Marilyn Manson at number 9, Rivers Cuomo of Weezer at number 5, Derek Whibley of Sum 41 at number 4, Lemmy from Motorhead finished at number 3, and at number 1, Chad Kruger. Here's a quote from one of the people who voted in the poll. My 5-year-old cousin saw him on TV one day and started screaming. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Scary Jesus man on TV." Man, you know, when you can beat Lemmy and his warts. Technical production is by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to The Ongoing History of New Music, a Deep Sky production.